This panel will be chaired by Professor Barbara Harris-White. Barbara Harris-White is an Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at Oxford University, Visiting Professor at JNU, Professional Research Associate at SOAS. Since 1969, she has taught rural economics and policy and political economy and helped build new institutions, including Oxford's MPhil in Development Studies in QEH. She has authored 40 books and 250 papers and chapters. She was awarded the Edgar Graham Award for Originality in Development Studies in 2009. We also have all our speakers on stage. I'm going to begin from the right of the stage. We first have Helene Fleury, PhD candidate and lecturer, Université Paris-Saclay. Damien Ehrhardt, Associate Professor, Université Paris-Saclay, France. Mariam Aslani, Researcher, King's College, London. Alessandra Mezzadri, Senior Lecturer, SOAS. And Kumari Sunita V, Assistant Professor, Madras Christian College. Can I now request the chair to please take over the proceedings?
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm delighted to be chairing this session, just as I'm very grateful to Adri for this entire event. Oh gosh, we can all see each other. It's sort of reflexive. This session is timetabled to last 3 hours. It's already started late, but I've talked to some of the paper givers, if not everybody, and I hope that we can divide it into half-hour sessions with the paper givers deciding themselves how much of that half hour they want to devote to discussion and how much they want to devote to talking about their subject. The general theme of our session, having sat through now 4 days of remarkable argument to the effect that Marx is still extremely relevant to the 21st century, the general unifying theme of this session is Marx in the here and now, various aspects from various disciplines. Okay, so our first speaker is Paula Rauhala. She is a Finnish philosopher, and she works on research on Marx in Eastern Germany and Western Germany, before and after 1968. She's secretary of the Karl Marx Society in Finland, and her title is Marx between 150 and 200 years, or that's what you're going to talk about. Over to you.
Thank you for a kind introduction. I also want to thank the organizers of the wonderful conference. Jan Hoff writes, Marx's critical theory of fetishism has become a central point of reference for a modern understanding of Marxism, which is represented by, among others, intellectuals who wish to distance themselves from the antiquated dogmas of traditional Marxism. The tradition to which Hoff probably refers is the so-called German New Reading of Marx, which was born in West Germany around Frankfurt School and the student movement of 1968. Hoff calls as a founding document of this school of thought the speech of a philosopher, Alfred Schmidt, in a conference celebrating the 100th anniversary of Marx's capital in Frankfurt in September 1967. In this paper, I ask why Alfred Schmidt, in his paper, and following him, the 1968 generation of the Frankfurt School, in its reading of Marx's Capital, why it emphasized the concept of fetishism as a key to Marx's critique of political economy, and I argue that there were good reasons for this in West Germany in the 1960s. One of the reasons must have been that the phenomenon of fetishism enabled the understanding of capitalism as destructive, and at the same time admitting that it seems to be quite habitable even for the blue-collar workers in West Germany. If Marx's aim was to explain why the proletariat would and should rise against capitalism, the Frankfurt School's challenge was to explain why it does not do that. But this was not, of course, Marx's question. It arose only after Marx's book had become influential and only after the workers' movement had achieved a lot. By the 1960s in West Germany, 8 hours working day, social security, large public sector and decommodification of large sectors of the economy. So I argue that the reading of Capital, which emphasized fetishism, made sense in 1968. But now another kind of reading is needed. This reading that I adhere to is also more accurate. And in this reading, the concept of fetishism is not primary in Capital. The function of fetishism in capitalism is to veil exploitation. And this reading, I argue, is today appealing because after the disappearance of the challenger of the global capitalism, it is returning back to the business as usual. So during the past decades, the length of the working day has not shortened and the wages have not improved, not even in the West. In 1968, in order to understand why this kind of reading of Capital arose in 1968 West Germany, I will make an overview to this peculiar historical situation. So in 1968, Germany was divided into Socialist East, German Democratic Republic, and Capitalist West, Federal Republic of Germany. The settings for the Marx and Marxist research in both states were very different. In the East, Marx belonged to the official canon of the socialist state. This meant that Marxist research had plenty of resources, but it also meant that the Socialist Unity Party had a strong political interest in interfering with the research, and this is of course detrimental to science. Yet, East Germany is especially interesting for Marx research, and increasingly so from 1967 on, when Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe was started in East Berlin. The 41 volumes of Marx-Engels Werke, which had started to appear during the Karl Marx year in 1953, was brought into completion on 150th anniversary of Marx's birth. During Karl Marx year 1953, also Grundrisse had appeared in East Germany, which was very important for the researchers in the West, as you know. Also in the West, the Cold War situation, not in the form of communism, but in the form of anti-communism, set challenges for genuine research on Marxism. The Communist Party of Germany, KPD, was banned in 1956. And further, Social Democratic Party, SPD, dissociated itself from Marxism in its Godesberger program in 1959. The forces which were opposing this general line were dismissed. This was the fate of the student organization, Socialist German Student Union, SDS. The relationship between SDS and the former mother party worsened even more as SPD entered into great coalition with Christian Democrats in 1966, and SDS, on its part, formed the strongest force of the so-called extra-parliamentary opposition. After the Second World War and until 1961, the economic miracle of West Germany benefited from educated labor power that streamed from the east to the west. After the erection of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the suddenly increased need for highly educated labor power opened the doors of the academy for the children of the non-academic parents. And they encountered a highly conservative and elitist university institution. This generation of students relaxed the academic culture and spread to revolt outside of the universities in its opposition of the emergency laws, Vietnam War, and finally against the bourgeois media embodied by the Springer House, which had helped to spread negative attitudes towards the revolting students. So the students claimed that Springer shed blame for an attempted assassination of the leader of the movement, Rudi Dutschke, in April '68. It is wonderful that this conference here in Patna refers back to another conference on 150th anniversary of Marx in 1967, organized here in Bihar. There was also another such a conference in the same year on the occasion of 100th anniversary of Marx's Capital. It was organized in Frankfurt am Main, where the former student of Adorno, Alfred Schmidt, presented an influential reading of Capital. Schmidt announced that all of Marx's categories have to be considered from the standpoint of societal conditions in which they do not apply anymore. The objectified appearances of human labor are products of our own activity. Our own actions solidify into a second nature in capitalism, into a second nature which is made by us but appears as objective and starts to govern us. In contrast to this special nature of capitalism, in communism, there would not be any forces or conditions existing independently of us, Schmidt claimed. If I understand Schmidt's talk correctly, this means that this philosopher is claiming that all of Marx's categories, commodities, money, capital, wage, interest, rent, emerge from our own separate and non-reflected actions, and they belong exclusively to capitalism. Then, after capitalism, Capital would be a pretty useless book. This was a peculiar conference because the philosophers of Frankfurt discussed here with the economists from East Germany. Political economist Karl Bichtler from East German Academy of Sciences made a comment on Schmidt's presentation by saying that it is a fact that individuals act and that as an aggregate result of their actions, certain economic laws emerge. If this was not the case, we would not need political economy. And we would not need to sit in this conference, Bichtler reminded. In other words, East German Bichtler asserted that also in socialism, laws and forces which are independent of economic actors still exist. So we have here two opposing opinions. Philosopher from Frankfurt is saying that in communism, individuals would plan and steer the economy consciously, and the social relations of individuals in production and distribution would be transparent and comprehensible, consciously regulated and planned. Social relations between human beings would not appear as objective relations between things. An economist from East Berlin, who is actually trying to plan and steer an economy with his colleagues, is saying that no, unfortunately, the abolition of capitalism does not yet make society transparent and does not abolish objective economic laws. Schmidt appealed to Bichtler, you should not fetishize in theory what is already fetishized in reality. I see as a problem in Schmidt's claim that it addresses the problem of fetishism in general rather than the problem of fetishism specific to capitalism. So now I move to the concept of fetishism in Capital, and I claim that Marx does not talk about fetishism specific to capitalism in the first chapter of Capital. He talks about fetishism specific for capitalism only after the fourth chapter, so only after he has introduced capital and labor market. So in the following, I present the meaning of the concept of fetishism throughout the 3 volumes. In the first chapter of Capital, Marx is talking about commodity production and market in general. The historical preconditions for commodity production are social division of labor and production of private producers for the market. In commodity production, the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor. Because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. Marx illustrates the meaning of this mystification by comparing commodity production with other modes of production, and the point here is that in commodity production, the distribution of labor and the product is not observable and is not under control. Marx writes, I quote, "The mode of production in which the product takes the form of a commodity is the most general and most embryonic form of bourgeois production. It therefore makes its appearance at an early date in history. Its fetish character is comparatively easy to be seen through. When we come to more concrete forms, even this appearance of simplicity vanishes." So now I move to a more concrete form, to the transformation of money into capital. So even if Marx has unveiled the fetishism of commodities and money, the formula of circuit of capital MCM prime appears as a mystery. Capital Because its value, it has acquired occult quality of being able to add value to itself. It brings forth living offspring. Marx's explanation of commodity fetishism does not help in explaining the occult quality of capital. Capital is a process of self-valorizing value, MCM prime, but there is one essential mediating link which does not appear in this formula. So Marx unpacks this mystery by introducing labor market. So unlike Ricardo, who imagined that already primitive hunters and gatherers employed capital and hired wage labor, Marx historicizes the existence of labor market. I quote, "The appearance of products as commodities presupposes such a development of social division of labor that the separation of use value from the exchange value, a separation which first begins with barter, must already have been completed. But such a degree of development is common to many forms of society. Otherwise, with capital, the historical conditions of its existence are by no means given with the mere circulation of money and commodities. It can spring into life only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence meets in the market with the free laborer selling his labor power." So exploitation is a social relation behind the occult quality of the original quantity of money to increase in value, and Marx unveils the real relation by adding mediating links to the formula of capital MCM prime. So the initial sum of money is invested in two different kinds of things, constant and variable capital. In distinguishing between constant and variable capital, Marx can differentiate between value produced by labor and value that the worker receives and spends on her means of consumption. Classical political economy, since Adam Smith, could not see the essential difference in the two parts of the invested sum of money. The whole tradition followed Adam Smith in this confusion. It did not differentiate between different functions of living and dead labor in production. It makes difference only according to mode of circulation of the part of capital in question. So the part which circulates piecemeal is called fixed, and the part which circulates all at once is called circulating. And thereby, the basis for an understanding of the real movement of capitalist production and hence of capitalist exploitation is buried at one stroke. So classical political economy reasoned that labor is a part of circulating capital together with raw materials, and these start circulating with the product, while machinery is fixed capital because it physically stays in factory. I quote, "This brings to completion the fetishism peculiar to bourgeois political economy, the fetishism which metamorphoses the social, economic character impressed on things in the process of social production into a natural character stemming from the material nature of those things." In the chapter on Trinity formula at the third volume of Capital, Marx explains that we have already demonstrated, in connection with the simplest categories of capitalist mode of production, the commodity and money, the mystificatory character that transforms the social relations for which the material elements of wealth serve as bearers in the course of production into properties of these things themselves. I jump a little bit. If we view capital first in the immediate process of production as an extractor of surplus labor, this relationship is very simple. The real connection impresses itself on the bearers of this process. So fetishism in capitalism is not all-pervasive. In actual process of production, the real relation is very simple and exploitation is still evident for the struggling parties. In discussion of the absolute surplus value in the chapter on the working day, in which Marx goes through the early legislation restricting the length of the working day, he quotes factory inspectors who talk about small thefts of capital from laborers' meal and recreation time. It is evident that in this atmosphere, the formation of surplus value by surplus labor is no secret. So in difference to absolute surplus value production, in the production of relative surplus value, as technology helps to shorten the necessary part of the working day and lengthen the time of surplus labor, surplus value seems to arise from capital and not from labor. I quote, "Capital thereby already becomes a very mystical being, since all the productive forces of social labor appear attributable to it, and not to labor as such, as a power springing forth from its own womb. In 1968, West German working class had benefited from the increase of the productivity of labor. In difference to this, today, the methods of absolute surplus value production, lengthening of the working day and intensification of labor are again evident, also in the West and also in Germany, as it has, of course, always been in most parts of the world. In most of the working places today, also in Germany, the source of profit in surplus labor has become much more evident than it was. In the second volume of Capital, Marx explains how the circulation time limits the time capital spends in the production process. The longer the process of circulation takes, the less time capital spends in valorization process. I quote, "But political economy sees only what is apparent, namely the effect of the time of circulation on capital's process of the creation of surplus value in general. It seems to furnish proof that capital possesses a mystic source of self-expansion independent of its process of production and hence of the exploitation of labor, a spring which flows to it from the sphere of circulation." So the annual rate of surplus value depends on the turnover time of the capital. If the turnover time is short, the same sum of money can valorize itself in the process of production several times. And this creates an illusion that surplus value originates in circulation. The next step, veiling the source of surplus value, is the formation of the profit rate. Average profit of a particular capital differs from the surplus value this capital has extracted from the workers employed by it, and therefore, normal average profit itself seems immanent in capital independently of exploitation. So there seems to be no connection between an investment in variable capital and profit. No matter what is the organic composition of capital, every investment of the same size yields same amount of profit. And further, commercial capital employing unproductive labor also participates in surplus value distribution without participating into its production. And yet further, industrial capitalists have to pay interests. So the distribution of surplus value among the industrial capitalists and the money-dealing capital is determined in competition between the both sections of the capitalist class. So Marx writes that the form of surplus value ossifies to the extreme against its substance. Profit of enterprise seems to accrue from the labor of the capitalist himself, and interest seems to be a natural yield of capital. Neither of the two parts seems to have a connection to exploitation. The formula of interest-bearing capital M prime spirits away all the necessary material processes between an investment and profiting. And finally, the monopoly over the land, which secures the landed property a portion of the produced surplus value, creates an illusion that the natural element itself, land, yields money. I quote, "Because in this case one part of the surplus value seems directly bound up not with social relations, but with a natural element, the earth. The form of alienation and ossification of the various parts of surplus value is complete. The inner connection completely dissolved and its source completely buried." So what I aim to show is that the theme of fetishism goes through all three books. And my point was that after the first three chapters, the concept gains its meaning only through the theory of surplus value. So I come to my conclusion. I claim that in Marxist theory of commodity fetishism, in Marxist theory, commodity fetishism, which means that products start to govern producers and relations in production and distribution are not observable and not under control. This form of fetishism applies at any form of commodity production. Schmidt and his followers tend to emphasize this problem quite a lot. But there are also fetishisms which are specific to capitalism, and these are attached to capital and wage form. In this form of fetishism, all labor appears as paid, and money seems to yield more money. And this problem is not so much emphasized by this generation of Frankfurt School. Why this is so? I speculate a little bit. In 1968 West Germany, the so-called problem was the high standard of living of the working class. And at the same time, students arose as an independent force in society. The revolutionary mood of the students clashed with the objective conditions of the working class in the West. In 1968, there had been a long period of growth, and also labor had benefited from it. In such an exceptional historical conditions, reading Capital with the focus on the problem of fetishism was for many radicals much more interesting than the emphasis on the theory of surplus value. That's how I see it. But today, the methods of absolute surplus value extraction are becoming more and more central, even in Germany. In intensification of work and lengthening of the working day, real relations are more or less visible, and therefore, I propose to Jan Hof and other followers of the Alfred Schmidt that we reconsider the antiquated dogmas of traditional Marxism. And the only reason why I do this proposal is that the antiquated form of society has been restored after 1968. Thank you for listening.
Paula, you have 5 minutes for questions and answers before we go on to the next paper. And yes, would you like to?
Well, I mean, I was very happy to hear your paper because I agree with what you said. In 1996, I published a paper in Research in Political Economy titled A Critique of Volume 1 of Capital, Volume 1, The Value Theory Revisited, or something like that. There I do discuss this issue, and I do think that there is a difference between the idea of commodity fetishism and the idea of alienation in Paris Manuscript. So the commodity fetishism is, as you have described, is basically market dominating division of labor and social division of labor. And so what do you do ultimately depends upon whether your goods have, give you sufficient price or not. And that's what you are getting dominated by the market. And fetishism is nothing but like, you kneel down and pray to the market, right? But the idea of alienation in Paris Manuscript is very much wage labor capital relation, where like, you have some sort of an essence of humanity, which is the creativity of man, and you alienate that and give it to somebody else. So that is the wage labor capital relation in which that comes into play. Now, what happens is that Lukács published his History and Class Consciousness in 1921-22, where he deals with the idea of reification. Now, reification is still more close to proletarian experience, and so it's closer to alienation of Paris Manuscript. But Paris Manuscript comes out in 1932 for the first time. And when the Frankfurt School people read Paris Manuscript, they said, wow, reification is there, and they connected these three concepts. And this connection is very, very quick. There is some sort of a connection, but I think I agree with you that they have not tried to make the distinction, and this is a problem in Marxism, that the distinction between social division of labor and wage capital, because there is a tendency to use that labor power is a commodity, and so it comes under the commodity relation, so the only commodity relation is important, and money people are very much into that. MCM prime, and that is the main thing. So I would say that if you try to bring in Lukács and the Paris Manuscript into it, and then see how it works, that would be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. We have run out of time, I'm afraid. There are two other people, but if we're going to keep to this discipline in this session, could you please keep your questions until the end, when I hope there's going to be time for general discussion. Thank you for your comment, and thank you for your extraordinarily good, dense piece of reasoning. We will have to bring the first paper to a close. The second paper this evening is by a couple of researchers. First, Helene Fleury, and then Damien Ehrhardt. Helene has studied history and anthropology and works on the synergy between the various arts. She's an activist in culture and in youth politics, and she teaches visual studies in the University of Evry. Damien has a habilitation in musicology and in cultural studies. He's a scholar of Schumann, amazingly interesting, and a Humboldt Fellow, and he also works on solidarity between France and Germany. And their topic is Marx, counterculture, and renewed Romanticism. So over to both of you.
Oh, thank you very much also for the invitation to this congress, to this conference. Vequaud was a French writer, a contributor to the Nouvelle Revue Française, a translator, a film director, and a curator. Today mostly known, we don't see the PowerPoint. Is it possible to switch to? So you see the pictures now. So I said Vequaud, Yves Vequaud, was a French writer, a contributor to the Nouvelle Revue Française, a translator, a film director, and a curator. Today, he is mostly known for his essays on Maithil painting. In the present communication, we aim to show the indirect impact of Marx's ideas on Vequaud as a player of the countercultural endophilia. We hypothesize that in the case of Vequaud, the traces of Marx go beyond the ideological references of the counterculture. We will try to assert this hypothesis in particular with the similarities of vision between both authors concerning the so-called communitarian Indian village as a counter-model challenging capitalist society, but stemming from a persistent Western Orientalist imaginary and primitivist schemas. I will begin with Marx aesthetics, an overview. As a poet, Marx was influenced in particular by E.T.A. Hoffmann's and Fichte's Romanticism and his academic studies about ancient literature and German classical aesthetics. The young Marx wrote poems inspired by the love of his fiancée, but his poetry treats also Romanticism themes as the primacy of feeling of human emotions, the situation of artists separated from normal life, the struggle against Philistine, or the opposition to an abstract and dehumanized world. In 1837, Marx left his vocation of poet to become philosopher. He combines poetry and prose, art and knowledge, fields that he considered to have been separated for a too long time. So, it's not surprising that he read Hegel. As a representative of Naturphilosophie, the latter aims to reunify everything, but under the metaphysics of the absolute. Marx was against the abstraction of Hegel's philosophy that he wished to escape. The then widespread notion of organic unity is playing a crucial role in his oeuvre. In his dissertation on late Greek philosophy, the atom is regarded as the material basis of the world, but it symbolizes also individual self-consciousness. Within a complex body, the atoms cannot be seen isolated from one another. As a higher unit, this complex body bears witness to the diversity of the world and its societies. In this perspective, Marx disapproved the abstract principle of the French Constitution of 1783 that may lead to a world of uniform and independent atom citizens, far away from the living forces of society as essential entity for human beings. After a life path that leads him from poetry to philosophy, Marx would have been well placed to write an aesthetics, what he did. With Bruno Bauer, he worked in 1841-42 on a critique of Hegel's vision of art and religion. But the two works, written within this continuity in 1842 on Christian art, are not extant. So it is understandable that Marxian aesthetics can be described as a not written aesthetics. However, art is evoked here and there in Marx's oeuvre, and his approach to art is often integrated into more general considerations. The notebooks of 1842 can give some few ideas about the supposed content of his not extant works on Christian art. Those notebooks introduce the idea of fetishism applied to religion. The latter worships the materiality of things. In contrast, art seeks to create organic forms through the intermediarity of imagination. For Marx, this is how to explain the dryness of religious art. The origin of organic conception of art lies in a free society which have to be organic too. It is interesting that Marx distinguished two worlds governed by the same organic principle, freely coexisting one in relation with each other. The real and the artistic words. Is there not a similarity with the early Romanticism, the Romanticist two-words model, Zwei-Welten-Modell? In that model, both universes are not parallel but interconnected. The negation of the real world provides access to the one of arts and music, which in turn retroacts onto the real world. The main difference between the early Romantist vision and the Marxian one is the fact that the latter did not oppose a poetic world seen in positive terms to a trivial one judged negatively. Marx is more and more attached to the reality perceived through our senses and gives less and less importance to idealism. In 1844-45, Marx wrote his first political economical works, the Parisian Manuscripts and the Holy Family, the latter with Engels. The Parisian Manuscripts developed the notion of alienated and estranged work, entäußerte und entfremdete Arbeit, which is constituted by, first, the estrangement of things, as working is not belonging to the worker's intrinsic nature, the production exercises power over him as an alien object. Second, self-estrangement, the relation of the worker to his activity considered as not belonging to him, as an activity turned against him. Number three, man's species being, the worker as a being alien to him, to his own body, his external nature and human aspect. And four, the estrangement of man from man as a consequence of the three first points. Marx deplores that narrow-minded relationships leading to equally narrow-minded senses are left after human being had improved his mastery of the five senses during a large part of the history of mankind. Althusser regarded the German ideology as an epistemological break, coupure épistémologique, between the ideological period of the early works and the scientific period after 1845. Furthermore, the German ideology was canonized in the 1920s, 30s as the founding text of the materialist conception of history. Surely, this periodization and canonization can be easily deconstructed. Nevertheless, from 1845, both authors would criticize the aesthetic visions of the young Hegelians, including Feuerbach, and show the interdependence between, on the one hand, the art and creative spirit of the artist, on the other hand, the history of economic and political life in society. They develop less an aesthetics than an analysis and critique of capitalism as a social system. For Marx and Engels, art and creativity are called upon to play a major role for the perspective of a re-aesthetized communist society in a time of disalienation. In the ideal society, everybody is doing from day to day various activities, including arts. There is no more division of labor, even between artists and non-artists. Quote, quotation, in a communist society, there are no painters, but only people who engage in painting among other activities. End of quotation. As long as this utopia would not be achieved, the economic structure of society may be not isolated from artistic production, hence the need for a mediation between base and superstructure. Marx and Engels gave also examples of pre-capitalist societies, among others the ancient Greek society, the guilds organizations in Middle Ages, and the village community in India. The most significant for our purpose is Marx's vision, influenced by Hegel, of the idyllic Indian village community as a pre-capitalistic, immutable form of organization. In the capital, he stresses the prevalence of possession in common of the land and the mode of production able to sustain a natural economy through the union of handicraft and agriculture. Only the surplus becomes a commodity when it circulates outside the village. Marx and Engels were looking for societies which are distant in time, antiquity, Middle Ages, and space, India and other Asian countries, with a pre-capitalist mode of production. But for them, these essentialized visions are neither the reflection of a golden age nostalgia nor the dream of an elsewhere. They consider in different steps the way to break away capitalism, pursuing the ideal vision of communist society.
Now I will focus on Vequaud's aesthetics and his similarities with Marx one. At first, I will evoke Vequaud's early writings in which could be seen the traces of countercultural romantic revolt. From his first writings, Vequaud followed on the heels of anti-bourgeois romanticism and critical thought. At first, concerning the extolling of emotions and body, the hippie movement called into question the self-control required to maintain one's rank or place, such as the body exists. Emotions are liberated from the social constraint of daily life, lived as alienation. For example, in Le Voyage en écriture, a forced hairdressing session is felt as a traumatic, symbolic amputation. An anti-conformist body ethics based on natural body posture is extolled. Later, his travel books on India are characterized by a creative bubbling stemming from a cult of pleasure and a hedonistic way of life. Exalted emotions linked to experiences of transgression and the questioning of social points of reference leads to a feeling that anything is possible. The feeling of festive liberation and freedom are associated with a spiritual register. In 1974, the initiation given by the Dalai Lama was described as one of the most extraordinary parties which you could see in the life. So these literary fantasies entail colorful sensorial descriptions allowing to open the field of the possibilities. The prevalence of affects matches with romantic hippie values in opposition with cold and abstract knowledge identified as stemming from colonization as antidote to romance and imagination. Concerning the critique of the values of bourgeoisie, Vequaud refused the social finiteness and the bourgeois mandate of remunerated work and family. In Le Voyage en écriture, life is represented as a train from which we must jump in order to escape from despondency, reminding Timothy Leary. Vequaud questioned also the function of education, which socialized children to accept hierarchy, in particular, in a provocative article entitled "The Parents Doesn't Love Their Children, the proof is that they put them in school." So this rejection of educational connections leads him to give up teaching and to invest in the writing that it considered as a vocation, after being awarded in 1967 by a literary prize, Félix Fénéon. Thus, Vequaud experienced a broke and happy hippie Bohemia. Concerning the praise of Bohemia, if Vequaud was able to accumulate cultural and artistic capital, his economic one remained very fragile. But he defied the petit bourgeois way of life from which he originated to seize the liberality of manners presumed associated with aristocracy and the upper class while experiencing precariousness. So, Vequaud, summed autobiographical writings revived a myth of Bohemia inseparable from a vocational art definition whose singularity regime reinforces the figure of the marginal genius. He evolved in a Bourdieusian economic world turned upside down, depending on different modalities. Regarding the mean for subsistence, he managed situations which he presumed to be temporary without too much concern for saving money. Concerning the autonomy of the field of artistic creation, the narrator of his novels aspires to a freedom auspicious to creation. In Le Voyage en écriture, he scoffs at a dreary routine and enjoins to drop out. Open your head, wash well your memory. This story is not yours. Go through, go through. Finally, as for posterity postpone, if Vequaud strove for glory and not for gain, contrary to the bourgeois artist who expects success, in particular financial one, and immediate notoriety. So Marx and Vequaud wished at first to make writing their vocation. Both appropriated common theme of early Romanticism, which are also those of counterculture. The exaltation of emotion, the critique of Philistine or bourgeoisie, the praise of Bohemia, or the cursed artist at the margin of the society, the common denominator between both authors can be found in the notion of Romanticism in the broader meaning of the sense forged by Louis and Serre. They define Romanticism not only as a literary trend, but more widely as an anti-establishment Weltanschauung against rationalization and commodification of human relationships. The second aspect of my communication will deal with Vequaud, Communitarian, Maithil, Village, Utopia. Since 1969, Vequaud spent 2 years in Nepal, India, and Ceylon, following the hippie trade. He discovered Mithila paintings in New Delhi and went to Mithila several times to meet a village painter. So Vequaud expressed a canonical form of the counterculture, the back to the land movement, in communitarian utopias within the Maithil village. His fantasy model shares the suspensions of dominant norms like phalanstery, monarchism, or communes, involving widening household, collective care of children, egalitarian rotation of domestic tasks. So gender, patriarchy, and family are redefined. He notes that men often do nothing else than keeping their lost bone on the knee. He adds, in West, one can count on the finger of one hand the painting woman who shines through the hair. Here, hundreds of women make marvels. According to him, in India, the example is not rare of society where women are more powerful than in our. So these projective presumptions, putting forward a phantasmagorical experience of gender resocialization, are reiterated in his writing. Here, Mithila painting contribute to undoing gender, maybe emphasizing the impact of feminist cause in the 60s. This village utopia serves his quest of alternative prophecy. It renews and epitomizes unchanging tradition opposed to mass and technocratic society. The rise of information age is accompanied by nostalgia for older ways of making things. As the romantic critics of Victorian age praise Indian craftsmanship, Vequaud attributes the perfection of Maithil art to a timeless village. Folk art is misunderstood as homogeneous, stable, and rural. He champions a return to a pre-industrial holistic community. He calls to lift on, as Madhubani, to find hamlets where the Maithil civilization stay alive. From his standpoint, the preserved culture of Mithila embodies the culture of India. His Utopia expresses a romantic nostalgia for the Heimat, embodied in an elsewhere, through which arise the Sehnsucht of a lost Eden. So he attempts to re-enchant the world, so does he by heroizing the woman painter. Vequaud emphasizes in his writing a revealing interpretation of the icons of his utopian counter-society. The Maithil woman painters are presented as prophetic figures of legend between holiness and genius. From his standpoint, to paint better than her neighbor is to be devout, as it were to become priestess. The artistic success of painters involves both the personalization of means as well as the depersonalization of the ends of the success, namely the creation of objects, crystallizing values recognized beyond the author. So it was traditionally reserved for heroes and saints. This literary fantasy bears witness to a picturesque vision of India within an orientalizing episteme. Vequaud praises a sort of Maithil Republic of Art through a pastoral myth and art religion prevalent during the first Romanticism. His narratives reflect in fact, a male Western style for representing the painter. They bore less relation to Maithil painters than to a crisis in Western self-representation. So there are many similarities between Marx and Vequaud's visions of the Indian village, the idyllic and timeless characters, the pre-industrial or pre-capitalist holistic community based on the union of art, handicraft, and agriculture. If counterculture tends to free individuals from collectivity, the holistic model of the Indian village marks a return to Marx's notion of organic unity. Besides, Indophilia prevails at Marx and Vequaud's time. Marx was living during Raymond Schwab's Oriental Renaissance. Reading the first published translation of Sanskrit, artists and intellectuals thought then to discover an echo of humanity's origin nearest to an harmonious nature and the divine. The Indophilia of the 60s underlined a similar cultural movement of romantic contestation associated to a second Oriental Renaissance, as underlined by Raphael Rousselot. At last, these two visions of the Indian community matches with Lowy and Searle's category of revolutionary and or utopian romanticism. The difference between both is that Vequaud's literary fantasy reveals more the nostalgia of an enchanted elsewhere, while Marx renewed pre-capitalist models as the Indian village in order to lay the groundwork for the communist society of the future. For the young Marx and Vequaud, freedom, and especially artistic freedom, is crucial. In this sense, socialist realism may be thought as the negation of the aesthetics of the early Marx. On the other hand, countercultural Orientalism, as represented by Vequaud, can be seen on a more obvious way as heterodox Marxism, as the negation of socialist realism. So, we are tempted to say that Vequaud's visions is the negation of the idea of the early Marx. One more reason to explain the similarity of both, following respectively a zeitgeist characterized by Romanticism and Indophilia. Thank you.
From Marx to countercultural romance via many other relationships between art and society. We have about 2 or 3 minutes. Does anybody want to ask a general question now? Because we have time for one question if it's quick and an answer. You want to think about it? Might I ask a quick question, which is in the Maithil case, the village. What are the land relations? And how is property, agrarian property, organized? Which must be the economic base for the division of labor that results in art. Okay, well, we'll leave that question up still. Can't hear. I can't hear.
I am not sure to know exactly precise fact about the regime of property, but I guess still big zamindar owing most of the field and very poor worker, maybe mainly Dalits working for the zamindar.
Okay.
But I can't assert exactly.
Thank you.
But the view of Vequaud is completely imaginary.
Thank you. Thank you for that very interesting paper. Our third paper is from Mariam Aslani. Mariam is from Iran. She studied maths and physics and then converted to sociology. And she has been looking at the sociology of ideas of Marx, Weber, Bourdieu, as they work themselves out in Indian villages. So she has related this world of ideas to field work. She's doing a postdoctorate at Wageningen, and she has asked me to tell you that this is her very first lecture. And she's going to talk about her PhD topic, which is Marx and the rural middle classes. Over to you, Mariam. mic.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Barbara, for the very nice introduction. So what I'm going to present today, as Barbara mentioned, is an extract of a chapter of my PhD thesis, completed very recently, and my doctoral research was about the rural middle classes, and which told the true story of the middle class formation in small villages in Maharashtra through the ideas of three major classical theorists of class: Marx through theorizing the ownership of the means of production, Weber access to social capital, and Bourdieu through cultural capital. And the research involved 18 months of fieldwork in 2 villages in western Maharashtra, and the empirical discussion which I'm going to present in the second half of my paper is drawn from my fieldwork findings. In most of his writing, Marx defined the term class in relation. Oh, sorry, I forgot that I have a PowerPoint here. That's the outline of my presentation. And anyway. In most of his writing, Marx defined the term class in relation to the ownership of means of production and the exploitation of labor. For Marx, there were 2 core classes in every capitalist society: the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie, and the workers, or the proletariat, defined as a class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to survive. Marx also suggested there was a small class of petty bourgeoisie that were not part of the 2 core classes. This class included self-employed individuals who owned a small-sized productive properties using family labor. Marx later attempted to conceptualize the term class. In the last page of Das Kapital, Volume 3, Marx sought to answer the question, what constitutes a class? He then defined a class as a group of individuals whose source of revenue were identical. On the basis of this definition, he stated that there were 3 classes in every modern capitalist society: wage laborers, or the owners of the labor power; capitalists, the owner of the capital; and the landowners, the receivers of rent. The sources of income were wages, profit, and ground rent, respectively. On the same page, a few lines before the manuscript ended, Marx introduced 2 additional classes: physician and official. He suggested that they constituted 2 distinct social classes because their respective members received their revenue from sources rather than productive capital and manual labor. Overall, throughout his writing, Marx did not situate occupations such as doctors, lawyers, priests, official, or other professional services in either of the core classes. This is because, according to Marx, they were unproductive in the production process, but necessary for functioning of the capitalism. This brings us to a long-standing criticism of Marx, which relates to his limited categorization of classes and his inability to deal with the complexity and diversity of class relations in advanced capitalist society. In particular, the existence of the middle classes has been termed the greatest challenge to the political economy of class in Marxist tradition of class analysis. Empirical evidence of a large middle class in contemporary advanced capitalist societies, where class structure looks anything but polarized, has been the primary criticism of Marx and Marxist scholars. Marx's writing on the middle class is scattered and fragmentary. In the manifesto of the Communist Party, Marx and Engels discuss the trajectory of the middle class and its historical transformation with the evolution of the economy from feudal to capitalist society. They argue that the middle class, which consists of peasants, small artisans, small traders, shopkeepers, and those whose profession were based on honor, such as the physician, the lawyers, the priest, the poet, and the man of science, would not be able to survive the capitalist mode of production as independent economic actors. They argue that the process of industrialization results in all forms of labor being transformed in factories, destroying the old middle class entirely and transforming the condition of the workers. While many were predicted to transform into workers, a small segment of them were predicted to become industrialists. Similarly, in the first volume of Das Kapital, Marx classified the middle class not as a core class, but as a class which fell between the 2 core classes. They were described as excluded from control over monetary capital within the production process because they lacked the investment necessary to accumulate surplus value. They neither create value nor are they forced to sell manual labor power to survive. They generate their revenue from the services they provide. A similar definition is provided in the second volume of Das Kapital, where the middle class were described as income earner as opposed to wage earners. Marx distinguished between wages and income. The latter is generated from non-manual labor, while the former is generated from manual labor. Similarly, Marx referred to government officials, priests, lawyers, soldiers, professors, journalists, writers, and doctors as the ideological representative and spokesman of the capitalist. In other words, a class working in the interest of the capitalist class. Marx termed them as such because their role, although unproductive in relation to the process of production, was necessary for capitalism to function. And similarly, in his manuscript on critical examination of the history of political economy, theories of surplus value, Marx made references to the role of the growing middle class in the continuation of capitalism through consumption. Here, Marx's reference to the growth of the middle class contradicts Marx's earlier account of middle classes in the manifesto, where he portrayed them as a class that would wane with the development of capitalism. This overview of Marx's conceptualization of the middle class is necessarily brief. Marx wrote very little about them and did not provide a full account of how the middle class should be analytically defined. He did, however, acknowledge the existence of the middle class as those individuals standing between the proletariat and the capitalists, whose conceptually cannot be situated in either of the two core classes. Their role was necessary for the reproduction of capitalism through the services they provided, which would facilitate the functioning of capitalism and through their consumption needs. This lack of conceptual clarification in Marx's writing in relation to the middle class brings us to this question: what constitutes a middle class in contemporary India, and how would Marx and other Marxist scholars situate them in Indian villages? I will return to this question a bit later, but let me first provide an overview of the ways in which the no-Marxist scholars have attempted to conceptualize the term middle class. So overall, there are four approaches taken by no-Marxist scholars that address the conceptual problem of the middle class. The first and the simplest strategy is termed the simple polarization of class structure, and involves placing all the middle class position in the working class category, except for a very small number of top executive and managers who also own some capital in forms of stock and therefore are considered to be part of the bourgeoisie. This approach deals with the problem of middle classes by denying its existence. The second alternative is to view the salary-earning middle class as a segment of other classes, a new petty bourgeoisie or a new working class. This approach retains the basic class structure of capitalist society while introducing significant internal differentiation between classes. However, this approach, like the first one, enforces the polarized structure of classes. The third approach considers the middle class as a new class in its own right, distinct from the working class, the capitalist class, and the petty bourgeoisie. This class is called professional and managerial class, the salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose major function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist relation. This means they exist and perpetuate capitalist relation. The fourth alternative, and the approach which to me is most persuasive and also applicable to India, conceptualize the middle class as occupying contradictory location within class relation. This approach, mainly advocated by Erik Orenleit, departs from the traditional conception of Marxist class structure by shifting the basic definition of class location from an exploitation-centered concept of class and combines it with the concept of domination, which is the ability to control the activity of others. In this combined approach, the exploiting or dominating group has the ability to control the label of another group to its own advantage. For example, the class location of manager is defined as contradictory because they are simultaneously dominators in relation to laborers, but also dominated by the capitalists. The concept of contradictory location within class relation is based on an assumption that each class location can be situated in different classes within a class structure. This is particularly useful in analysis of classes in India, where the diversity of income sources can situate a person in more than one class location and in different classes within a class structure. Now I'm going to return to the question I posed earlier. So what constitutes a middle class in contemporary India, and how would Marx and other no-Marxist scholars situate them in Indian villages? To answer this question, The remainder of my presentation focus on how the emergence of industrial plants in periphery of two small villages in western Maharashtra, where I undertook my doctoral fieldwork, has resulted in diversified mode of accumulating surplus and the existence of new forms of livelihood alongside agriculture, which in turn have resulted in the formation of new class structure, and most importantly, formation of classes that cannot be situated in either the capitalist class, class of labor, or petty commodity producers that have been previously identified by the Marxist scholars of India. Due to limitation of time, I have put up a very brief overview of these villages in the PowerPoint slide behind me. I also have put a figure illustrating the land distribution in these villages. In the next slide. That's the figure in the corner, in the right corner. We can see the highly unequal nature of land distribution in both villages and the high concentration of land among the few big land owning households. It is also worth mentioning that one of the major features of these villages is their proximity to various factories and production plants. These factories range from food packing to car part production, dairy production, sugar mills, and etc. According to village residents, the factories have had an overwhelming positive impact on the socio-economic development of these villages. The emergence of this industrial unit has resulted in significant diversification out of agriculture by providing employment opportunities for village residents. It has led to a significant rise in land prices and increase in inward migrations. The evidence gathered during my fieldwork suggests that economic diversification has taken a number of forms in these villages, both in relation to means of generating income and the modes of accumulating surplus. The evidence shows an increasing range of occupation undertaken by family members, both in agricultural and non-agricultural sectors, and simultaneous participation of family members in multiple economic activities. The expansion of non-farm activities such as involvement in dairy production, poultry farming, petty trading and petty shopkeeping, transport, construction work, employment in various government sectors, and most significantly, employment in industrial sector, both as skilled employees and unskilled workers, is evidence of non-farm diversification among rural households. Significantly, on average, almost one person in each household is engaged in economic activities in these factories in unskilled, semi-skilled, or skilled employment. Such a degree of diversification in the source of livelihood and multiple sources of income, both in agricultural and non-agricultural activities, combined with the high degree of inequality in the ownership of land, livestock, and other productive assets, has significant implication for class formation. New classes are formed which cannot be situated in either of the core classes, but can sometimes be situated in both. These class locations are in the middle and are conceptualized here as the rural middle classes in a Marxist framework. I will elaborate on this a bit later. Now I consider the entire class structure in these villages, of which the middle class defined here form a subset. To classify a household using a Marxist framework, I have used four main criteria: the extent of ownership of land and other productive units, the extent of exploitation of labor, using net labor index, the formula is on the PowerPoint, and the extent of, and the extent of hiring in of non-agricultural labor power, and okay, so the third criteria, whether or not a household has sold any labor in farm and non-farm production, and the last one, the extent of surplus production and modes of accumulation. Analysis based on these four criteria, I identified four classes in rural India. So I'm going to go.
Can we have a... It's working here. Can we have it on both sides? Oh, it's coming.
Is it working? Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first class is, I term it the land owning capitalist class. This class only constitutes a small population of both villages, consists of wealthy households with a large amount of land, which high level of income and a high level of asset and livestock. It contains big landowners whose economic activities mainly constitute large-scale appropriation of surplus in form of agricultural labor and produce. The members of this class do not perform any physical labor themselves and depend entirely on buying the labor of others. They are required to hire in a large amount of labor in a systematic way all year round. This class often tend to adopt diversified mode of accumulation to non-farm type activities. This includes the expansion of economic activities to other farm-like production, such as dairy and poultry farming, involve investment in non-agricultural activities such as purchasing production units such as workshop, investing in construction, engaging in real estate and rental market in nearby cities, or investing in farm-related machinery such as tractor fleets, which can be a source of profit through rental. Overall, they accumulate surplus in both agriculture and non-agricultural sector. They are also heavily indebted with easy access to credit. The neo-capitalist class. This class constitutes a small population in both villages as well. It's a class that also has emerged in the last 10 years and is composed of wealthy households, primarily characterized by high level of income and high value of household asset. This class includes a small-scale business owners and industrial labor contractors who are still involved in agriculture. The members of this class do not own the means of production on the same scale as the land-owning capitalist class, but they accumulate surplus by having control over labor and wages. They usually own medium-sized agricultural land. The family members in this class do not perform any activities in their farm production, and their land is cultivated entirely by hired-in labor. They tend to accumulate surplus to diversify to non-farm activities such as investment in a small workshop and production unit, but they usually rent the site of the production rather than owning it. They also hire a small number of non-agricultural laborers in their production unit. They are called no-capitalists because although they do not own or have control over as much capital as the first group, they invest their profit in production with the intention of becoming largest capitalists. Like the first class, this class is also heavily indebted, primarily because of easy access to credit. They are surplus producer, and their surplus is reinvested in expanding non-agricultural production plants, purchasing consumer durables such as cars, and building new residential houses and expensive education for their children.
10 minutes.
The farm-owning skilled workers, or the middle class, and this class is a focus of my PhD research. And this class, what I term the oscillating middle class, has primarily emerged in the past 10 years as well, and consists of households that earn their living primarily from a skilled employment in non-agricultural sector, but these classes are still very much involved in agriculture. The form of skilled employment vary, but often includes supervision and management in factories and a small number of government employment. The household in this class are surplus producers and exploiters of labor power in agricultural production. On average, this class owns 4 acres of operational land. They are permanently employed in non-farm sectors, owing to their education, skill, and social connection, and use their income from non-farm employment to invest in agricultural production. This farm-owning skilled workers class is characterized by an income which is considerably higher than the village average, but lower than the first 2 classes. Most of the income in this class is generated from employment in non-agricultural sector. They use their income from non-agricultural skilled work to invest in agricultural production. This investment includes expanding operational land, improving access to irrigation, hiring in agricultural laborers, purchasing profit-making capital such as car and tractor, and investment in non-agricultural form of capital such as real estate, consumer durable, and private education for their children and grandchildren as a strategy to ensure lucrative employment in the future. They are distinguished from petty commodity producer and farm-owning industrial working class, which I will explain in a minute, by the fact that the members of this class do not sell their labor power in agriculture, do not exchange labor, and do not use family labor at all, except for major tasks such as supervision and occasional work during the time of harvesting. I have also termed this class the oscillating middle class because the class situation is ambiguous and tend to oscillate between that of working class and the agricultural capitalist class. Yet they are not accurately part of either of these core classes, falling between the two. They are part of the working class because they are exploited as skilled workers in relation to non-agricultural capital. They do not own the means of production, and their income is not in the form of shares. They are also simultaneously part of the agricultural capitalist class because they own the means of production in agricultural activities and exploit the labor of others in agricultural production. The peaked expense of hiring in labor in agricultural production is met from selling their labor power in the industrial sector. The availability of such forms of employment combined with the abundance of labor power, mainly inward temporary migrant agricultural workers, means they have access to cheap labor. However, they are not entirely part of the capitalist class, as they do not systematically hire in labor and their level of capital ownership are insufficient for producing a significant surplus for reinvestment. They are also not part of the laboring class because they do not produce a deficit and are able to meet their subsistence needs through the use of family labor if needed. The upper layer of this class, which includes supervisors and managers, has the potential to generate a sufficient surplus that over time can be invested in new means of production or expansion of existing production unit. Over time, therefore, they have the potential to join the no-capitalist class. The lower layer of these oscillating middle classes does not buy labor power as much and is unable to generate a surplus sufficient for reinvestment in production or agricultural expansion. In contrast to the upper layer of this class, the lower layer are vulnerable to falling into the petty commodity producers if they lose their skilled employment in the industrial sector, or into the industrial working class if their agricultural production fails over a sustained period.
5 minutes.
Okay. Petty commodity producers are defined as households that produce and reproduce themselves through family labor. The salient feature of this class is that they have some flexibility in hiring in and hiring out and exchange labor power. Although the average net difference between the selling and buying of labor power is usually zero. Overall, they usually produce neither a surplus nor a deficit. Members of this class primarily generate their living from farming, livestock such as daily production, petty shop, and other independent non-agricultural activities such as plumbing, transport, and other ad hoc independent activities. As with any other class, this class is not homogeneous. The upper layer of this class consists of those who occasionally exploit the labor of others. Their land is cultivated by family labor and occasional hired labor, and they are surplus producer in a very modest way. They tend to have diversified mode of non-farm accumulation, such as a small-size production and produce with family labor. At the lower layer, they are most likely to move toward the class of labor or the industrial working class because their earnings are not sufficient for reinvestment and expanding their capital. The availability of non-agricultural work in industrial sector also attract the younger generation of work seekers who prefer such employment to self-sustained farming and petty production. Overall, this class is similar to one of the conceptions that Marx deployed as a middle class indicated in the beginning of this presentation, and therefore constitute one fraction of the rural middle class. The farm-owning industrial working class consists of those households who use their own labor, mainly women, and exchange labor on their own farmland, and they hire themselves out occasionally in agriculture, but earn their household income primarily from casual employment in non-farm sector. This includes semi-skilled to skilled machine operators with the work contract often 6 months at a time, and they have a secondary source of income from agriculture. This class is very similar to petty commodity producer, except for its industrial working members, because the household in this class own enough operational land to generate family livelihood. However, the younger member of this class are mainly engaged in industrial work, where the income from such work is much more than the income the household generates from agriculture and livestock. This class is also differentiated from the two classes of labor because the household in this class own enough operational land to generate a modest family livelihood, and also because the industrial employment is not at ad hoc terms, and although casual, is carried through a certain period, usually 6 months at a time, and also because the employment requires a degree of training and skill. And I have also identified 2 classes of labor. Household whose primary source of income depend on selling their physical labor power for daily survival. They systematically sell their labor power both in agriculture and non-agricultural activities. As we can see in this table, the majority of households in both villages actually belong to the class of laborers. I'm just going to conclude now, do I?
Yes.
Okay. Overall, the rural middle classes, which were the primary focus of my research, are situated between the capitalist class, including the no-capitalist class, and the class of labor and the farm-owning industrial working class. They consist of the farm-owning skilled workers, which I term the oscillating middle classes, and the petty commodity producer. These 2 classes, in simple terms, fall between the 2 core classes and cannot be situated either in the capitalist class nor in the class of labor. They therefore constitute, in Marxist terms, the middle classes. The emergence of the rural middle class, here in particular I am referring to the skilled industrial workers. So the emergence of these skilled industrial workers with new source of income have transformed the class structure of rural India. The 3 major classes previously identified by scholars, the laboring classes, the agricultural capitalists, and petty commodity producers, are no longer adequate to understand rural differentiation and the rapid transformation of class structure in the current phase of industrialization, when household can simultaneously belong to a variety of class in itself within the Marxist structure. Overall, the rural middle classes presented here today retain the Marxist structure in relation to ownership of the means of production and the labor relation, but also called for the flexibility within the Marxist class structure. It takes into account a Marxist approach to classes while also mirroring the diversity of livelihood and various forms of accumulation that exist in rural India. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. What you've done is shown how to integrate the middle classes, take them seriously, integrate them into agrarian class analysis. And I think that's important because most people in this country don't believe there is a rural middle class at all. And I think now we have to rethink that. 1 or 2 minutes. Does anybody have an urgent question? Please.
I was just wondering, since a Maharashtra village, which is a rather industrialized nation, the distance of the village from the nearest industrial town would make a lot of difference to the class analysis that you would repeat. Just keep in mind when you do the analysis. Okay?
Of course, yes.
That would be very different in Bihar.
Yes, absolutely, yes. I don't generalize my findings in any way.
That's it.
Good point.
Thank you.
Okay, we now move, throughout this session, we're moving between theoretical and philosophical papers and papers which are about actually existing topics. And we come now to Kumari Sunita, who is a philosopher at Madras Christian College and an expert on Heidegger and Sartre. She has very wide interests in philosophy, in language, gender, education, and philosophy of science. And she's going to talk to us tonight on Marx, on Sartre, and alienation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barbara Harris-White, and good evening, on and all. I extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Meghnad Desai, Adre, and organizers for inviting me for the conference on the occasion of commemorating Karl Marx and his writings. I will be speaking on the topic entitled Sartre and Alienation, a Marxian Perspective. This paper has 3 parts. First part, I will be discussing on the early writings of Sartre, his concept of alienation in the early writings of Sartre from mid-1930s. And secondly, on later writings in 1980s and writings and 1918's interview with Benny Levy. And their third part will be interpretation of this through Marxian perspective. Let me start my paper. As all you know, Jean-Paul Sartre is one of a French thinker who later sees the limits of the movement he is leading and tries to transcend Marxism in his later writing, though unsuccessfully. Sartre considers man as a person in the world. And in Being and Nothingness, Sartre begins with an appreciation of phenomenological method, which according to him has conceived significant results in philosophical investigation. And his main problem of philosophy is problem of being. According to him, being is primordial and transphenomenal in character. This primordial transphenomenal character being ruptures into two modes of being in itself and being for itself. For convenience, I may interpret as being in itself as world and being for itself as man. Being in itself is complete in itself, according to Sartre, and being for itself is incomplete and fluid. Being in itself, being for itself, man originated from being in itself, world, through negation or nihilation. And Sartre characterizes man as a being constituted by non-being. The action of questioning, interrogation, absence, negative judgments, and destruction as elements of being of man shows that man's being is fundamentally the origin of nothingness. In interrogation, we ask a question, and this presupposes ignorance. It is a non-being. The answer to the question may be either affirmative or negative. If the answer is negative, it is clear that we appear before some non-being. If the answer is affirmative, which involves negation, according to Sartre, he calls non-being of limitation. What occasions is nothingness, according to Sartre, is freedom. There is no difference between being of man and his being of free. Sartre is usually having an exaggerated view of human freedom, no doubt because of the claims in the existentialism and humanism lecture and later in Being and Nothingness that, I quote, there is no determinism, we are free, we are condemned to be free. Condemned because he himself thrown into the world. Free because he is responsible for his own actions. Let me elaborate this literary work, Iron in the Soul. Matthew, the previously inefficient school teacher, acts meaningfully and decisively for the first time in his life. I quote, Matthew was in a hurry. He kept his eyes on his man. He had plenty of time. The German army is vulnerable. He fired. The man gave a funny little jerk and fell on his stomach, throwing his arms forward like somebody learning to swim, unquote. In the narrative, Matthew's shooting of German infantrymen is freely chosen and deliberate act for which he alone is responsible. It is a deeply significant act metaphysically, personally, and politically, according to Sartre. Metaphysically, it is the determination of the life. Personally, it is Matthew's recognition of his freedom. And politically, it is a commitment to resist the forces of right-wing totalitarianism. I have quotes for all these arguments, but I am leaving it for I may losing my time. And therefore, according to Sartre, nothingness, freedom, and anxiety provides the conditions for making possible for the movement of bad faith or self-alienation. Self-alienation or bad faith is a form of self-deception which one hides the truth from one's own self. In lying, one hides the truth from other, but in bad faith won't come from outside. Sartre discussed men in bad faith to substantiate this very assumption that a freedom may be and is negated by itself without any external coercion or manipulation. And this state of man's existence erases one of the basic being of unity of facticity, that is of limited objective presence and transcendency. Unquote. Man as a facticity is what he is, and he is in itself, just as any other object. But he is at the same time a transcendence, one who negates his own present condition and transcends towards what is not. And he has given a wonderful 3-4 examples. He has given one example. Has given. I may try to read. Takes this example of a woman who consents to go out with an amorous suitor. She must decide what she seeks to postpone the decision. It is at this time the bad faith comes into play. She leaves her hand in his, but does not notice that she is doing so. She becomes a thing. All intellect divorces her soul from her body and transforms her body into an object or a thing into the mode of being in itself. Her hands becomes a thing, neither consenting nor resisting. She loses her subjectivity, her freedom and responsibility for decision. She is in bad faith. Unquote. From this example, Sartre states that the bad faith or alienation comes to play through decision or choice. His conception of bad faith is one of the better known ideas of philosophy, but it is too often misunderstood as either a purely ethical notion or as a specific problem which he employs as a foil against Freud. And conversely, Sartre has cited the bad faith of the woman who denies her sexuality in many places. In fact, it may be plausibly argued that there is not a single character in his works that escapes bad faith. Gazin of No Exist, Matthew, Age of Reason, and nearly all women in such writings, Inez in Estelle, No Exist, Electra of Flies, Marcelo of the Age of Reason, Lizzie in Respectful Prostitute, Jessica of Dirty Hands are in bad faith by virtue of their sexuality. And also he has given another example, and he distinguishes two kinds of people in bad faith. One kind he calls cowards, other one swine. And there is a beautiful example in Nausea for Requindin concludes his tour of portraits of his bourgeois official in the City Museum with the comment, "You bastards." They felt that they had the natural or God-given right to exist and to occupy their social location of wealth and privilege and suppress the freedom of others. And another example, he was telling about Peter in the cafe. He said he was explaining about the thing-like behavior of the waiter. Then he says that it is not of course there is a social conditioning, but this is an internal negation of consciousness, that the thingless behavior, he is acting as a waiter. Thus, every state of bad faith, self-alienation in Sartre's writings, slavery becomes a free choice of one who is subject to the state. This is how, in Sartre's existentialist philosophy, being for itself becomes being in itself. He quote, subject becomes object and nothing becomes everything, unquote. There is another, let us see how he develops his third manner of being for others in his writing. And there is another, one is relationship with others, that is society, I interpret as society, is manifested through look. The other looking at me, as well as me looking at the other, apprehend each other as an object and the subject. Subject is freedom. When the other looked at the freedom, is suddenly objectified. Subject becomes an object. Sartre invites us to imagine one listening through a door and looking through the keyhole. Suddenly one sees a footstep behind. One will be under the gaze of the other. One feels shame. He quote, "I am ashamed of myself. I appear to the other because the other puts me in the position of an object." Unquote. His own body is not an object for him. It is an object from the perspective of the another. And another's body is an object from his perspective. In this situation, it is not a psychological option for him to sincerely doubt that other people exist or minds, but he offers a phenomenology of the body and rather the pessimistic ontology of human relations. And conflict, he again has another, all human relation he connects with alienations. And conflict as a pervasive form of human alienation. Sartre says that his descriptions of human relations have to be understood within the perspective of conflict. Conflict is ultimately conflict over freedom. The relation between men, thus projected, is one of possession of freedom itself by the other, and the meaning of such a relationship is conflict. Then there will be a question, why we might object, should not conflict be overcome in love? Sartre's answer is, love is conflict. Even love is desire to possess the freedom of the beloved, and it involves the alienation of the lover also, unquote. Referring to the love, Sartre says, quote, the lover's freedom in his very efforts to make himself beloved as an object by the other is alienated by slipping into the body for others. Here, in fact, we encounter the true idea of lover's enterprise, alienated freedom, unquote. Hatred also explained in the same way. I'm not going to read this thing. And approach to Marxism. I move to approach to Marxism. Sartre, of course, has been seen the limits of existentialist philosophy and gravitated towards Marxism in his writing, later works. But even after accepting the Marxist interpretation of history as valid, he retains existentialist premises either in pure and veiled forms. But we can see in the critique of dialectical reason, he observes that for the majority of us, our beliefs and prejudices are virtually unsurpassable precisely because they have been experienced during childhood. Irrational responses and resistance to reason are artifacts of these early years. A period, a class interest are interiorized as personal shackle. Thus, Sartre cautions that class bias should not be entirely ascribed to the individual confrontation with the means of protection, as either as capitalist extraction of surplus value or proletarian victim of that process of exploitation. He claims that many attitudes and prejudices are acquired prior to leaving the family itself. Each child leaves the family, leaves the reality of the social class without the confines of home. And here Sartre proposes to classify the intersection between history, social structure, and biography. I think I'll leave that explanation, and for the time being, I'll skip to another point. Later, and Sartre's first concerns himself with the process where a person moves beyond the existing situation. It is here he introduced the project and praxis. He regards the project to the person's choice of one course of action from another, among number of alternatives. The actions do not remain, but is continuously modified in accordance with the changing circumstances. Praxis refers to the actual surpassing of the existing situation in order to realize the particular and outlined in project itself. I think he has been influenced by, I could say, the Marxian concept of human labor when he was in the capital. Marx wrote, a spider context is a big quotation, I don't want to read out, but last part I read, at the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the labor at its commencement. He not only affects a change of form in the material on which he works, but also realizes a purpose of his own. Here, in Sartre's terminology, the imagined goal corresponds to the project. The actual building of the Sartre refers to the human praxis. I also remained of not only Aristotle, but also Francis Bacon here. I'll come to it later. What Sartre outlined is how the choice of project is also influenced by the particular history of the individual. He insists that the original childhood project will really influence his future attitudes and behavior. And in this context, he again introduced alienation. He maintains that in the eye of most Marxists, everything seems to happen as if men experience their alienation and their reification first in their own work, where in actuality, each one lives first as a child in his parents' work. According to Sartre, people continue to live this alienation, products of their parents' design. They are never fully able to overcome this early distortion of character, unquote. Nevertheless, Sartre's use of alienation is problematic in this content. It is highly debatable whether his term is in fact compatible with Marxian concept. Unfortunately, Sartre himself shed little light on his controversy. In his career, he employed alienation in variety of ways. But I also want to mention the interview with Benny Levy in the last interview 1980s. The interview with Benny Levy, Sartre completely dismissed the relation of production as a primary one. He quotes, "I don't believe that the relations is the primary one. There are neighborhoods of workers who have settled in the cities. What unites them are profoundly beyond the mode of production is they are human beings. All Marx superstructures are fine work, but it is utterly false. Because primary relationship with the individual to individual is something. Family relationship is with respect to any other, primary relationship is primary with respect to any other relationship," unquote. Benny Levy, Sartre, Benny Levy, 1996. As a he has given lots of interpretation of, he employed alienation in a variety of ways. As a result, we are forced to, but he didn't give any, he himself has given any solution on his controversy of different positions. As a result, we are forced to construct our own interpretation of Sartre's alienation on the basis of earlier writings. In his earlier writings, Sartre, we have existentialism with subjectivity, individualism and absolute freedom pushed to its limits. The limit situation of existentialism is its own negation, and Sartre's conception of human reality is just based on this negation. If individual is taken in isolation from society and posed against it, his subjectivity is detached from objective being. If existence is separated from essence, then what remains is either brute, unconscious being, or void or fantasy. Sartre realizes, like all other existentialists, freedom is absolute negation of freedom in bad faith and objectivity, and the desire to be in a fantasy. For Sartre, freedom naturally tends to be in itself, and thus it is absurd freedom. It is absurd also because it is a freedom to choose and not a freedom of not choosing. Only in the imperialist phase of capitalist society, on the other hand, even the bourgeois concept of freedom comes to end with the end of competition and action. Freedom may be suspended into an absurd fundamental project to a private appropriation of the world. Private appropriation is thus projected as the essential element of the being of Sartre for itself. As such, it does not only mystify the actual historicity of the relations of production in a capitalist society, but lends to it an ontological meaning and justification. In fact, the fundamental problem of philosophy, the problem of primacy of mind over matter, here again primary importance. Sartre is opposed to materialism, though he tries seriously to give a realist semblance to his being for itself and being in itself. He retains the mind-body dualism, even treats nature and body idealistically as a relation of bad faith alienation. Even though Sartre does not conceive consciousness as a substantive being, he gives all being to its nothingness. In other hand, posited as absolute freedom of the individual, subject is conceived as self-nullifying, as thingness, as bondage, and every social relation is seen as invariably involving alienation. Thus, man's alienation or bad faith or his stage of bondage is projected as an eternal, untranscendable, ahistorical, untranscendable state of existence. Another aspect of idealist notion of freedom has been and remains with Sartre is interiority as opposed to exteriority. Freedom is internal negation of freedom. It is so conceived only because the practical activity of man, the act of labor through which he objectifies his subjective powers, is not seen as an act of creation of the realm of freedom in the world, as an act of objectively changing and thus controlling nature. Let me conclude. Such alienation may be theoretically sound. It may capture the lived experience of certain individuals in the capitalist society. Man evolves out of nature. If he is alienated from nature, there should be a way of restoring the original bond of man with it. At the same time, man is social by nature, and individual is human only when he is social. Furthermore, existence never without essence, and if there is any contradiction between essence and essence, that is real determinations of man's being, his existence, his particular being, it cannot be overcome by negative essence, but by transforming the existence, by changing, dehumanizing conditions of man's being. Therefore, Karl Marx rightly pointed out, philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumari. Seems to me, not being a philosopher, that there are two contradictions in Sartre between alienation and freedom and alienation and possession. But I'm sure that's because I'm not a philosopher. We do have time for a number of questions, if people would like to ask questions on that profound paper.
Sartre wrote Critique of Dialectical Reason, but you didn't speak about, did you speak about that? Maybe I missed it. Yeah. Because you were making some connection with Marx, so I thought you will speak about that. No?
I spoke about it.
Oh, sorry.
When he was
Can you please put the mic, put it on?
he was when the group and I think I'll just have a human group, according to Sartre, should be understood in reference to the horizontal complexity. I left it because I explained as well later from the praxis, project praxis, all this from dialectical critical dialectical reason. And here he was discussing about the horizontal complexity and horizontal complexity and vertical complexity. He says that horizontal complexity corresponds to the social structure, and it involves the specific relation of the group to the dominant social institutions, and historical dimension is accounted with the vertical complexity. And these two have three phases according to him. And the first phase is one of the situating person within the social structure. It involves straightforward analysis of the society. The second phase is the regressive explanation of the personal history. At this point, he was bringing existentialist approach into the dialectical reason as well. Introduce existentialist approach in order to amplify conventional Marxian approach. And the final phase entails moving from past to the present to attempt to grasp current situation of the individual. Sartre claims that, that's what I said, he supposes supposed to classify the intersection of the history, social structure and biography. There he says that, claims that the threefold methods will progressively determine a biography, and by examining the period of studying the biography. Therefore, again, he was only bringing the internal aspects of human being, not the social aspects he's not bringing in this particular book as well. That's what my argument was.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
I'm wondering to what degree Sartre ever entered into any dialogue, serious dialogue with others who had attempted to, in a sense, escape the influence of Heidegger and move towards Marxism. I know that Marcuse was Heidegger's student, and Marcuse writes about Sartre, writes a critique, and Adorno writes a critique of Sartre, but very friendly critique in the authoritarian personality sections that have recently been published. So Sartre went to Germany, in a sense, to get his existentialism, but I wonder if he ever went to Germany to, in a sense, overcome it, you know, by looking at those who had a developed critique of Heidegger and of existentialism.
I didn't understand his what's the question? It was not, what I understand is, I think Sartre, Heidegger's conversation with Sartre you are asking, or?
I'm just asking whether Sartre ever entered into any dialogue with the Heideggerians that turned against Heidegger towards Marxism. Above all, Marcuse would be the great example of that.
Of course, Althusser, Herbert Marcuse. I don't know whether... basically, Herbert Marcuse was Heidegger's first graduate student in Germany. And Herbert Marcuse has, Herbert Marcuse has written many later on regarding the Holocaust. Sartre.
Heidegger with him. That's what he's asking. Maybe you don't know that.
I'll answer later.
Shall we take this question up in discussion afterwards? Okay. We now turn to the last paper of the day by Alessandra Mezzadri. She is a senior lecturer in development studies at SOAS. She's conducted long-term field research in India and also research on labor processes in India and China. And she's tried to compare these very difficult things to compare. So she's looked at labor in a wide variety of production conditions, but she also works on ethical consumption, on feminism, and on social reproduction theory. Her topic for tonight takes us from the stratosphere of Sartre to the sweatshop factory conditions. And she's going to talk about exploitation, social reproduction in the sector of garments, and she regards India as a massive garment factory. Okay, over to you, Alessandra.
First of all, thank you very much to the organizer of ADRI. I'll repeat what many have said already, but this is really a fantastic conference. I learned a lot, so I'm very grateful to have been invited, and thanks for all the organizers and those behind the workings of the conferences as well. Okay, so when I approached what to write for this conference, being a field worker, mainly I try to ask myself, after having done a fair amount of work on sweatshops in India, well, in China just a little bit, what a field-based perspective on Marx can actually bring. And I think it can be quite a fruitful exercise to try to bring Marx with us during field experiences, and to ask ourselves, or his framework, generally speaking, what is it that can guide us more? So I try to do this sort of ex post reflection on what have been some of the tropes within the Marxist framework that inspired more, or that speak more about the fieldwork that I've done. So today I'm going to talk about Marx in the sweatshop, and try to show you which are the tropes that I consider key for the development of my work. Now, these are three. I have to say that I can identify more, but for the scope of this particular presentation, I'll focus on three. And the first is how it starts the very analysis in Capital Volume 1 from the commodity form, which I consider fundamental. The second is the distinction between absolute and relative modes of surplus extraction, and how they play out in the sweatshop. And the third is the distinction between processes of real and formal subsumption of labor. And all the three cases, while I celebrate the way in which we can bring Marx, Capital 1 with us in the field and very fruitfully, I also have to say that we need to complement it. And for me, it's been very fruitful to complement its insight with insights from the radical feminist literature, particularly insights around social reproduction, which, although are just becoming center stage yet again in recent years, I'll just then, I have to say that I learned the most from the early debate on social reproduction as it played out in the 70s in the work of Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, Silvia Federici, and Leopoldina Fortunati, among others. So starting from the first trope that I want to talk to you about, well, already Marx in the first chapter writes as the world by 19th century appeared already as an immense collection of commodities. And if we just relate this to the world we live in, of course, that cannot be more true. We have heard during this conference how processes of commodification of knowledge, of commodification of the ecology have become rampant since Marx actually wrote. And we can also add commodification of the very body if we think of a country like India that has become central to processes of global surrogacy. So the process whereby you can actually outsource the making of babies. Now, capitalist things, Marx writes, are special things because they have two types of value. One is use value, which is in their sensuousness as things. But then the other one, the real value, is their exchange value that transcends this sensuousness and basically is based on their containing labor power. They're containing labor power and congealed quantities of labor time, given that between workers and capitalists, then the workers is left with only one commodity to sell and bring to the market with him. And we only learn how this happens at the end of Capital Volume 1. So ergo, the value of things under capitalism are based on exploitation, and Marx starts with the commodity form exactly to point at the way in which instead bourgeois mainstream political economy has naturalized the value of things. However, in doing that, of course, he had these purposes. So he writes, the commodity form and the value relations of the product of labor within which it appears have absolutely no connections with the physical nature of the commodity and the material relations arising out of this. Now, of course, you can have different takes on what this means, but you have to consider that Marx was engaged in the process of deconstructing and criticizing the mainstream bourgeois political economy of the time. So that was its aim. That doesn't really mean that necessarily there's nothing of the physical world that speak about the social world of labor, because indeed studies of labor process actually highlighted that it very much does. And insights from both people studying the nature as well as feminists have highlighted instead the great correspondence between the world of the physical and the world of the social. So the physical and social materialities of production really interplay in very interesting way. And you can refer to the work of Fernando Coronil on land and nature, but also you can refer to the work of many geographers like Neil Coe and others. Now, feminists have been particularly interested in the very functioning mechanisms of the labor process and its social aspects, going beyond the early debates started by Braverman. Now, I think in order to understand what really I'm talking about in terms of this correspondence between the physical and the social, I think I'll just introduce you to what I called in my book India's sweatshop regime. That is, to an extent, the world as reimagined by global buyers and exporters and representative of capital, by the same token is also the world of labor that comes to being when we look into the way garments are produced. So starting from competition, because this is what it really is, the relations between competition and exploitation that actually Marx wants to highlight, I'll introduce you now to the world of the sweatshop regime. Now, if you interview buyers, if you interview suppliers, if you interview any type of producer, it will just represent India and their choices vis-à-vis India outsourcing as a giant garment mall. So you have to imagine you're stepping in a massive H&M, and actually suppliers and exporters and buyers produce different things at different floors of this mall. So the entire country is reimagined as a giant factory where you have different types of product specialization. So they just don't make garments of any type everywhere. They make specific garments in that place for a reason. And of course, there's a history behind this, and I do not have time to go into that, but it's well documented in the book. And starting from the north, we have more niche type of production. In Ludhiana, you have woolen production. In Jaipur, you have print-based production. In Delhi, you will have ladies wear intricate production, while the south is instead a world of basics, of jeans, of shirts, of outerwear. Now, why is this relevant? Because in the north you do these things with a very complex and fragmented product cycle, which entails smaller factories, shorter runs, and the sort of incorporation of multiple type of ancillary activities into the labor process. And instead, in the south, you do this in much larger factories and on assembly line production, while in the north, assembly line is only semi, and group systems tend to dominate. So there is a huge relevance to what you do in terms of the products made. Now, if we look at the world of work this corresponds to, which is really the sweatshop as a regime, turning from focus on competition to exploitation, you will see that is very relevant to the distinction between different commodities, garment commodities, and the type of workforce that is at work. So starting from the north again, when you have short cycle, where you have small factory sizes, where we have a massive process of labor decentralization to the home-based sector and to petty commodity production, you have factories mainly inhabited by male migrant workers from the Hindi belt. In fact, Bihar is a massive contributor, together with Uttar Pradesh. Around 80 to 90% in factories, as a matter of fact, come from these two states. And instead, you have a combination of different forms of petty commodity production, as well as disguised forms of wage labor in the households, the home workers proper as well. This army of home workers are partially based in cities and urban areas, but the majority, as a matter of fact, of the work is decentralized towards rural areas. The district of Bareilly has become a massive global village producing for the global economy, with millions of home workers and villages incorporated, according to our last surveys, are getting all the way to Uttarakhand. Now, in the south, where there's a completely different types of seams and products, you also have a completely different type of assembly line, 80 to 90% feminized. And here it makes a lot of sense because you have much more continuous type of production, larger factories, and there's a key not just to continue producing according to the industrial needs of this production, but is also key to cost minimization by agenda. Now, of course, you can argue there's path dependency involved. Path dependency is always involved, but it's the fact that you have world markets that allow the continuous incorporation and reproduction of this path dependency that is really the issue here. So what I'm trying to say is that while we start from the commodity as a form, and it gives us key insights between the relations between competition and exploitation, then looking at labor processes is only by looking at the social profile of the workforce that you really understand how the global assembly line in India as elsewhere, is highly racialized and highly gendered. And this become the very basis of the formation of the foundation of processes of class formation in the industry. So not only gender and race are not epiphenomenological, I never managed to say these words, to class, but they also the very basic strata on which class then is formed. Now, getting to the second trope of my presentation, so the second way in which we have to bring Marx with us in the field and in the sweatshop in particular, is Marx's insistence on the relevance of processes of absolute and relative labor surplus. And of course, there's a difference between the two. We heard Helene initially actually spending time on that, so I will not spend much time on this, and we all know. But just to say that generally, because of the horrors described in relation to absolute surplus value, we tend to sort of assume that as always the most horrid forms of surplus extraction there is, but actually also relative surplus value can be quite terrible indeed. And more than anything, because it involves processes of cheapening of labor, this can entail cuts in wages, particularly in areas where the institutionalized power of labor is low. Also, machinery can alienate, and this is described quite well by Marx when he described workers in the large industry as quoting, living appendices of a lifeless organism. And this is also to deal with the fact that processes of de-skilling further turn the workers more dependent onto markets and onto capital. Now, crucially, Marx also highlights that while we tend to see these two processes as an either-or, the two processes go hand in hand. And indeed, they go hand in hand within the sweatshop regime, but not only. We have very clear-cut cases whereby modes of absolute surplus extraction reinforced or are reinforced by processes of relative surplus extraction. Now, in Delhi, for instance, you do have directly the realm of absolute surplus extraction when you have a massive lengthening of the working day with workers at our last survey in 2013-14 working something like 12 to 16 hours per day. Workers in larger factories will end at 12, while workers in workshops will work at up to 16 hours. However, it's also true that it's built in a system of short runs, but also labor itself circulates and hence reproduces the break-in service. So migrants, circulating migrants are not only retrenched, but they actually leave the industry after 8 to 9 months, also because they live in appalling conditions in industrial hamlets. And this has the effect of allowing capital to externalize all costs for the social reproduction of labor, and in turn, the process of cheapening of labor takes place at the same time of the lengthening of the working day. So it's a case where from absolute to relative modes of surplus extraction, we have dark synergies. In Bangalore, exactly the opposite takes place. When you look at the organization of production in assembly line, you see the labor cheapening, i.e. modes of relative surplus extraction dominate. But then with the imposition of absurd, unobtainable targets, what happens is from these modes of relative surplus extraction, then exporters obtain then absolute surplus extraction, because women have any way to work until the target is reached, which means that although we start from relative modes of surplus extraction, we end up with a lengthening of the working day nevertheless. Now, of course, the synergetic ways in which absolute and relative modes of surplus extraction interact is enabled by discourse naturalizing social inequalities, and an obvious case is that of women that is discussed also in many other cases of literature discussing the global assembly line from a feminist perspective, and I'm referring to the work of Leslie Salzinger, Terry Caraway, Melissa Wright, but also in India we have fantastic work by Saraswati Raju and Leela Fernandez that has a fantastic work on jute from the 90s. However, of course, in India, it's also obvious in terms of caste. And while caste was not a massive part of our stories in factories, where the majority is composed by OBCs, at the very bottom of the sweatshop regime, we have an overrepresentation of low-caste Muslims. These are mainly incorporated as home-based forms of work of different types. And I do not have time to go into the great variety of types of home-based work you have. But basically, my point here is that these groups are unable to valorize their labor onto the labor market, and their bodies are cheapened far more hitting the gates of the sweatshop regime. So for some group, also labor in the public sphere, if you see their relations with contractors, the way in which the negotiation for rates happened, they experience exploitation in ways that exceed the ways in which we think about the social economic contract, for however abusive in general. So it becomes a performance in subordination and oppression and humiliation. And I just really echo Mary John's words that we really need a labor theory of stigma for understanding the sort of experience of exploitation by both women as well as lower caste in India. Now, there are some recent Marxist contributions that would like to convince us instead that we need to talk about yet a third form of labor surplus extraction, and one where you have the remuneration of the cost of labor which is below its level of social reproduction. But actually, if you look at the history of capitalism, there are really many classes for whom this has been simply the norm. So we don't really need to use as a baseline the very minuscule and restricted experience of the labor aristocracy, because Marx's categories are more than enough. It's more the fact that his early assumption that labor is remunerated as its reproduction cost is all it was. It is an assumption. Now, the third trope that I just that will take the presentation to its conclusion is the fact that across the sweatshop regime, it's really relevant to look at processes of both real and formal subsumption of labor. And we have real subsumption when proletarianization happens in the classic case and involves the double freedom of workers from means of production and from subsistence. Now, formal subsumption is when capital instead incorporates the labor process as it is. So there is a takeover of reproduction, but that is not corresponded by a takeover of the means of production. Now, there is a relation between the modes of surplus extraction, but they're not the same thing. The first refers to the strategies and ways in which surplus is appropriated, while the second is much more wider and broader understanding of how exploitation takes place. And actually, the formal and real subsumption of labor are what Jairus Banerjee has recently called forms of exploitation. And as a matter of fact, in India, generally speaking, and indeed across its sweatshop regime, these two forms are both very stable. Now, in Marx, when you read the discussion on the difference between the two subsumption process, which is not in Capital Volume 1, but it's in the appendix on the results of the immediate process of production, there is an expectation that there be a transition from one to the other form. This is absolutely not what it can be observed in India, where it is dominated by the proliferation of petty commodity production, something that already Mariam talked about, but also by disguised forms of wage labor. And at least within the industry that I'm looking at, this is because processes of formal subsumption actually resolve crucial issues of cheapening of the labor force. So they become stable by the fact that they actually cover a fundamental role within the development of certain industries. And you observe armies of home workers in sectors such as this, but also in others, electronics, etc., as process of decomposition of the industrial, many industrial sectors actually document. And not just here, but in China, because in China, with a fantastic team of Chinese scholars, we also found something that is not really written much about, that there are armies of home workers as well. It's simply that the literature has not covered them enough till now. Now, dispossession also, on the other hand, doesn't take the form that Marx described in his, of course, in his classic discussion in Volume 1, and particularly with the case that I'm describing, also the real subsumption remains ever incomplete, because also factory workers, at our last survey with Ravi Srivastava, as a matter of fact, from JNU, we just took the sample of around 350 workers, and over 40% of them actually owned land. Which means that they could go back to this land, and this is a study that focuses only on the national capital region of Delhi. They could go back to this land in the 3 months of lean period, which have a lot of implications. These workers are not fully dispossessed from the means of production, and this becomes really useful for capital that can continue externalize their cost of social reproduction without ever internalizing this cost, in a context where the state itself has failed to internalize this cost. If you consider that still we don't have, very simple example, not the only one, we still don't have social portability in India, so that all these moving masses will not be able to access a huge chunk of their social contributions. Now, so the current analysis of processes of exploitation and dispossession, in fact, show how social reproductive realm are at the very core of value generation. And here I go back to what I said at the beginning, that particularly insights from the social reproduction early literature is fundamental. Now, when Silvia Federici writes that the primitive process of primitive accumulation is a hugely gendered experience, and Maria Mies talk about accumulation starting from the bodies and the homes and the villages of workers in the lace maker of Narsapur, they had actually, they were pointing at the way in which reproductive realms and activities directly enter the circuit of value generation. And I want to only point at 3 ways in which this happened before concluding. First, realms of daily social reproduction and turning into key sites for labor control. And you can, of course, imagine this much more easily if you think of China and the rise of what Punnai and others have called the dormitory labor regime. However, also in India, the function of industrial hamlets, they're led and managed by labor contractors, often linked to the factory, also, if you want, shape a dormitory labor regimes in the open. And these have effect. The fact that you're able to control workers outside places of work means that you also manage to expand rates of exploitation. So these directly enter the circuit of value generation. The second is wider realms of intergenerational reproduction. The home, the village, the community work as a continuous subsidy to capital as they reabsorb again and again the circulating migrants. And this, again, is not enabling value generation, but is directly contributing to exploitation rates. The third is the reproductive activities in the forms of domestic and care work, but in India, actually in much more expanded form. If you think about in the NSSO, the huge amount of activities that are listed as unpaid, mainly performed by women, fetching water, fetching wood, etc. if you think about all these activities, this further depress the cost of socially necessary labor time for capital. There's like leaving it large like never before across India's sweatshop regime, and of course we all know that well beyond that. So that Silvia Federici, for instance, suggests, and I think she does have a very provoking point, that even homework has to be discussed in the light of ideas, of processes, of formal subsumption. Now, I concluded the presentation. I think with the conclusion are quite self-explanatory in the sense that I think it's, we can make a great use of Marx as field workers. Capital Volume 1 is also a fantastic research framework that we can bring with us in the field. But of course, this contemporary capitalism, we're trying to actually grapple with. Marx himself had two main aims. One was a critique of the bourgeois political economy of his time, and the second was an understanding of contemporary capitalism. And I think for this scope, we need to incorporate insight from the radical feminist literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. We don't have any time for questions. On the other hand, we are moving into the final part of this session in which all 5 papers are open for discussion. I should say that this panel is a microcosm of the conference. We are from 6 different countries. We have a token man, whereas usually it's the other way around. The papers have all been of high quality, as have been the discussions so far. We represent a lot of disciplines. Philosophy, logic, history, cultural critique. We've been talking about commodity fetishism in more than one paper, capital-labor relations, the concept of alienation in Marx and other philosophers, exploitation running through all of the papers, countercultural romance and primitive communism. We have looked at the relationship between art and society. We've looked at artisan artists, factory labor, and rural middle classes, and finally, social reproduction. So the floor is open for a very wide discussion of a very wide set of papers. Meghnad. Can we have the mic, please, for Lord Desai? We'll come to you afterwards. There were 2 people who wanted to ask us.
Okay, thank you all very much for the paper. I have sort of a question for each one, so I'll keep them short. Not each one, but at least more than one. On the Marx 150 to 100 years, I think it's a very good interpretation that they needed an excuse to explain away why German workers, West German workers were so happy. You know, they had high wages. Now that is very much a common factor across Western Europe. Sometime when you get time, you should look at different countries, UK, France. How did each group of Marxists invent an excuse, a sophisticated excuse? Because given the Soviet Union being there, it's very different. Now we don't have to worry about it. Now we don't have to explain those things. But I think existentialism, which was discussed in nation, was another way of explaining, you know, as it were, they may look happy, but they're not really happy. They're alienated in a different sense than the sense in which Marx talked about alienation. And Sartre's alienation is different from Marx's alienation. It's completely unconnected from any production process or any social process. So that may be, anyway, that is a thing for future. For the Fleury Ehrhardt paper, it's just a comment. You know, how did I mean, it's one thing to understand that Marx and Engels had never been near an Indian village, so they could invent a completely mythological Indian village. But that's, okay. But how did this man go to Bihar in the 70s, which was one of the most turbulent time in Indian history? You know, there are demonstrations taking place by Jayaprakash Narayan across Bihar. How did he find an idyllic existence? I mean, one really wonders. I mean, it's one thing like the othering. It's the opposite of othering. You know, because it is strange to you, you think it's lovely. And maybe you ought to think about that. And I think that I'll only make one more comment on the last paper. That was, you talked about superexploitation, and you had one or two references, and I think that's a very interesting concept, which has also been mentioned in terms of the position of black Americans. Is there something called superexploitation, which is above the kind of Marx exploitation because of race or gender or things? And is there a theoretically viable, theoretically rigorous structure, or is it just an excuse? But I think I'll give you a reference later on that. But I think it's very important to make quite sure super exploitation is not just an excuse to explain data you can't explain.
Thank you. I think there were two questions earlier on from, so far I can't see in focus.
Yes, I have a
Thank you.
I have a brief question for Paula Rauhala. There seems to be a problem with this, with claiming that commodity fetishism exists before capitalism, because first of all, Marx says in Chapter 1 of Capital, the part that you quoted from, he clearly says in that section discussing commodity fetishism that in pre-capitalist societies, in contrast to capitalism, social relations are transparent in their simplicity. So it doesn't seem possible for social relations to be transparent in their simplicity and to be subject to the mystification of commodity fetishism at the same time. On this issue, it doesn't seem one could be a little bit pregnant, to use the expression. So I'm wondering how you can defend that claim based on that passage in Capital. And just quickly, lastly, related to this, of course, we know commodities exist before capitalism. This is clear. But the question is, does the commodity form define human relations before capitalism? It seems to me the difference between commodities, discrete commodities, and the commodity form, which is what Marx singles out as the secret of the commodity fetish, is what can only prevail under the conditions of the capitalist mode of production, which also implies its negation would be fundamental to the definition of socialism.
Thank you. Was there somebody else on your side who wanted to ask questions to Paula? No? Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Please.
Hello to everyone. I would like to ask something to Alessandra. I found the talk really interesting. So I agree with you that you are saying that we should use radical feminism and Marxism together, and that gender and race are not epiphenomena of class, mere epiphenomena of class. But the question for me is, how can we use that feminism? That is, can we just integrate Marx theory with that feminism, or will the use of that feminism change completely, radically a Marxian framework? And the point that how can we connect together gender, class, and race? I mean, if they are not epiphenomena, is there a hierarchy between those factors? And if not, how can we connect that? How can we have a theory of the social totality without a hierarchy? And yeah, is that?
Thank you. Shall we pause and then we will have another round of questions, because otherwise the people on the panel will forget all the questions that have been asked to them. So there are questions to Paula, to Helene and Damien, and to Alessandra. Perhaps we kick off with Paula.
Thank you for all the questions and comments. So my point of departure was this German new reading of Marx, which is quite popular in Germany and is also gaining obviously popularity in the Anglophone world as well. And their key claim, they don't read Marx's early texts, but they read Capital. And their key claim is that Capital is not positive political economy, but it's a critique of fetishized forms inside capitalism, and that's it. So I'm very critical towards many key claims of this school, but I wanted to ask that this has to make some sense in the context where it was born. And so we can trace this school of thought in 68 in student movement in Frankfurt. And then how I explain this, why they have this emphasis on this concept of fetishism, why they deny so strongly that you could have positive political economy, Marxian political economy. I can find two reasons for that. First one is that I pretty clearly said, I guess, that the students were revolting and the workers were not with them, and they needed an explanation for that. And the second that I didn't talk about so much, but the second is the existence of East Germany. So I think that also what explains the kind of spirit of this school of thought is that there was East Germany was it was present in their everyday life. And as we know, the Frankfurtians, they were really disappointed with the socialism as it existed. And so in GDR, they also produced commodities. And these countries were in systems competition with each other, and both had pretty similar goals. So both tried to offer a good standard of living, nice commodities, and you go to work, and then you get a good level of consumption. These were the terms of competition. And I guess that these radicals were not very satisfied with this kind of model of socialism, or this is at least how I've reasoned it. So to Peter's critique, I understand. Maybe I answer this way. In this conference in '67, there was a delegation of East German economists, 4 very prominent economists, and then Ernest Mandel posed questions to them, and he had 5 very difficult questions and critical questions. And one of them was that if you produce commodities, then you necessarily also have commodity fetishism, alienation. Are you not even trying to get rid of them? And Klaus Steinitz, who was in the Central Planning Committee, he answered that yes, it's a good idea. It's true that if when you have commodity production, then you have certain side effects, and it could be good to decommodify many sectors of economy, but we cannot do it with all sectors of economy. So this is the perspective from which I look, but maybe, sorry, maybe you're not satisfied.
Thank you. Now perhaps Helene and Damien.
I don't know. No. Do you understand? Yes, very interesting question about the idyllic character of Marx never had been in India. I think we spoke about this. I think Hegel had also this kind of view. And I think there are different explanations, perhaps. At once, there's an influence, of course, of the first Romantic writings, and writings of German philologues also, who are very interesting in India. Sure, at the other hand, you have a very large documentary very precise documentary of Marx about India with a lot of colonial cliches, but an analysis too. And that I think that these two approaches, and you can bind it with, for example, the approach of the view of Italy, India as Italy, and India as Ireland. And so you can see this view that a European could have about Italy and the projection of India. That is very interesting. And the coexistence of these two approaches is very important for the beginning of 19th century. I imagine, for example, about Alexander von Humboldt. He had a vision, a scientific vision of things, but he has also a very poetic vision of things. That, I think, for the beginning, for the early Marx, it may be important, but it's sure when you are speaking about Marx and India, it's not early Marx. But I think this played a real role here. But I forget something certainly, but you have some, no?
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for the great questions. Very big questions, some of them. I'll just try to do my best. Starting from super exploitation, rigorous or not, I'm working at this at the moment, so I have mixed feelings about it, and I guess the guts and the sort of instead more rational, perhaps, or historical analysis, pushed me perhaps in two different directions. Well, one was, of course, originally linked to the work of Rosa Luxemburg, and then later picked up by Marini. But I think they were discussing this very much in relation to its link with super profits. So in a sense, how they put it made sense. Well, now the new debate on super exploitation, it seems to me, is very much linked to modes of surplus extraction. And I have the feeling that it's becoming the Marxist equivalent of modern slavery, what is called modern slavery in liberal circles. What this type of approach does is it exceptionalizes whenever we have accounts whereby labor is not paid at the cost of social reproduction, which instead historically has been the business as usual for many categories of workers. So my fear is that to just be more theoretically proper and work on these terms, that we actually lose the sight of history that teach us instead that this has always been the case. And perhaps we can talk later on that, because I find it a very exciting debate. Nevertheless, I'm having big arguments with John Smith and others. The integration of feminism is definitely necessary, and I think it was aborted in the 70s out of two things: sheer fear that the all labor theory of value would collapse, and also the political aspect of that that manifested in the Wages for Housework campaign of Dalla Costa and James and others. Now, first because if you read, there's a very interesting authors working on the fetishism of the wage and on productivism with Sebastian Rioux, a Canadian, and he actually made a very helpful remark, being a Marxist and actually doing beautiful work, that effectively Marx assumes a self-reproducing production sphere. And this he does because the aim is to defetishize capitalist production as represented by liberal bourgeois political economy. So to try to recall in the labor theory of value what is not there in the first place, which is the production and reproduction of the worker, i.e. of life, of us as people, it's actually agonizing over trying to do something which the labor theory of value was not supposed to do in the first place. So I just don't think that we can that we have to particularly agonize around saying that, of course, reproductive activities and realms are crucial to processes of value generations, and they were yesterday as they are today, and this has been the experiences of women for since the onset of capitalism, because it's capitalism that placed them in the home, and actually turn their work into unpaid labor and unproductive labor. It's a fiction, and this is half the world's population. So we have to be able to do this without obsessing about the labor theory of value. Now, the second question, which is even bigger that you're asking me, well, there is beautiful work that has been done. Well, of course, as a critique, you can put forward of intersectionality, but if you look at the work of those that embraced it, that made it really powerful, if you look at the work of Angela Davis, if you look at the works of Hortense Spiller, there is fantastic literature that traces back to indenture. There is the work of Gayudhra Bahadur on coolie women. There is literature that actually look at process of class formation and already show that these are false dichotomies. There is no category that comes before the other. There are only different concerns. So if you're interested in processes of class formation, of course, for you, class is the independent variable. But then if you're interested in domestic violence, of course, you'll start from gender. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we have another round of questions? There's a gentleman in the green shirt who's been wanting to ask for some time.
Thank you all for those papers. They were really excellent. Just a few questions. Paula, I'm worried that you said that we've returned to an antiquated form of society. I mean, maybe the critique in 1968 is better because it was staged from a higher level, higher wages. It was, in a sense, a more difficult problem. I hear you saying, you know, now we have absolute surplus values, made a big return, and conditions of labor are degrading. But wouldn't, I mean, that just seems to be to lead into a politics of nostalgia for social democracy. Whereas, in fact, what we're seeing in '68 is discontent with social democracy. And that doesn't seem to me something that we would want to dismiss. That would, in a sense, be a high point of critique that we want to return to. More substantively, I agree with Peter that the issue of fetishism not being specific to capitalism is problematic. I would say that it's not even, it's specific to capital in the sense that it's not a problem that would be appropriate for Adam Smith to even deal with. It's not a problem for bourgeois thinkers. For Miriam, I want to ask, first of all, you know, to what extent have you engaged with the vast literature of Indian Marxism on rural class differentiation, which seems to me to derive much more from Lenin than it does from Marx, from particularly the development of capitalism in Russia and the categories that he develops there. And one of the things that it seems to me that you're pointing to is the way that that old rural sociology assumed a very strong urban-rural divide, that there was a rural world and there was an urban world. And what you're talking about, in some sense, is about the breakdown of that division and the need for the development of new categories. But I'm not sure that Marx would be the best place to get that from, but rather the history of Marxism in the 20th century that dealt much more with the peasant question and therefore developed categories for it. I have questions for the others, but I don't want to take up any more time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have two questions. Here.
I think there was somebody down here. Yes. And then you. Thank you. Yes.
I have short questions to Alexandra Mejadri. I like all the papers, but just I have a short question. And your paper is very interesting, and in explaining the exploitation in sweatshop in India by using Marx's concept of absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. So you explain that the exploitation of sweatshop should be explained not just by absolute surplus value, but by relative surplus value. Regarding that, my question is that you described the cheapening labor as surplus, relative surplus value. So when you presented, you equated the cheapening labor with the relative surplus value. But my question is that cheapening labor, so cheapening
of commodities.
So, for example, cheapening labor due to de-skilling, skilling you described as a production of relative surplus value. But in my reading, I think Marx defined relative surplus value as not just cheapening labor, but cheapening of the value of labor power. So that, value of labor power. So just low wage or decreasing, just low wage is not, so cheapening labor is, so if you describe that sweatshop, in exploitation in sweatshop is also the product of the production of relative surplus value. I think you should find the evidence of the decrease of the value of labor power. That means that is a decrease of value of consumption goods that workers purchase and consume to reproduce their labor power. So,
thank you very much.
Can I answer
No, you
that
can't.
question?
Sorry, you can, but after the person at the
Okay,
back.
I have two quick questions. First question is to Mariam. When you are trying to classify the various classes in rural India in your field survey, you talk about labor hiring in and hiring out. Now there has been some labor hiring in and hiring out. So there has been some work by Utsa Patnaik. Are you following her methodology? A. In case you are not following her methodology, she is also taking into account the labor equivalent of rent, interest, and so on. So if you could just throw light on that, number one. Second question is to Sunita. You have argued that actually, even though Sartre came over to Marxism and began to adopt Marxist positions, some of his existentialist ideas and concepts remained. That I understand is how you sum up his argument. My question is, did it also impact his relationship with the French Communist Party?
Thank you. And I think this is our final question, and then we'll...
It's not a question, I just want to answer him, so that she doesn't have to answer that.
Please, can you answer concisely?
What you have is that you have a live labor time, right, which is adding to the value, and you cut it somewhere where you have surplus value and variable capital. Now what Marx is doing is maintaining that wages are fixed. In that case, the way you increase the relative surplus value is by cheapening the wage goods through technical change. That's what you are asking, you are saying. But her point is that, it's basically moving the variable capital portion this way, right? And if you can just reduce the wages, right, not fixed wages, reduce the wages, it's the same thing. Look, the slide is just going that way, so it is increasing surplus value, which is increasing relative surplus value, so it's not a problem.
Okay. We'll have to call an end to the questions, and I would like to call on the panel to respond, both to the proximate questions now and anything else they want to say in order to wrap up their own presentations, their own arguments. So can we go from my left to my right and begin with Kamal?
My first question was from Professor Evry-Val-d'Essonne, and I don't know whether it's a question or comment. but I want to respond to your comment. And you are absolutely right that you have to see the both philosophies separately because they have put forward the alienation in two different ways. But the Sartrean claims in later writings, he was adopting Marxian alienation. Unfortunately, he never understand the Marxian. Here, diametrically opposite position he has taken in understanding of alienation, and he didn't explain the alienation in the terms of history, and also he forgot to say that psychologists already that animals as well as human beings have both gregarious and self-preservative instinct, but unfortunately, Sartre explained gregarious element in the terms of self-preservative element, instinct, sorry. Therefore, even the three stages, yes, and even the anarchist stage, anarchism, he didn't write any books on anarchism or treatises on anarchism, but his anarchism was in his behavior. But he still continued as an existentialist position in his writings, even all from 1903 to 1980, till his death. Even the interview with Benny Levy, his stand was on existentialist position. That's it. And Sadat, and then he was not a part of Communist Party, Paris Communist Party. He was part of Communist Party, but he was not a member of the party. But he was even the compact, he started writing later in this thing, and also he was associated with Marxist-Leninists with this thing, and also he was these Merleau-Ponty, Albert Camus, and Simone de Beauvoir, these people meet in the cafeteria to discuss about. He was influenced by communism, also part of the movement, but not the member of the party.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I think a lot of this will need perhaps further clarification later on. But basically, main point that I wanted to raise is how we used to actually to approach the issue of modes of surplus extraction with an either-or sort of intuitive question, and particularly for labor-intensive industries, there is this assumption the relative surplus extraction, wherever you don't have technological upgradation, is simply not there. And my argument is this is an incorrect reading on how, in practice, industries like sweatshops work, because while you have finite levels of technological upgradation, you do have instead very rigorous technical organization of productions which correspond to industrial needs. Now, if you look at the way in which the technical organization of production is set up, in many ways what starts as being an attempt to sort of expand the relative surplus value rate then turns into a mode of absolute surplus extraction and vice versa. And I made those two examples because they're exactly the opposite. From one, you get from over time, so it's driven by absolute value extraction, well into the setup of an overall technical organization that involves also the cheapening of labor. So that was my point, and also correspond to a cheapening of commodities overall. Anyway, Marx discussed the fact that the relative surplus value does not necessarily only happen by machinery. It's only done in the chapter on the large industry that, of course, he will expand on that. But, of course, we're talking about industries where you don't have yet, although there's been an announcement of automation of 150,000 jobs in the textile industries in the south, so we'll have to see what happens there. So what I'm saying is, although it's not necessarily the case on automation for those industries, still there's a massive scope to talk about the way in which the two processes interact. Thanks. Thank you. Paula.
Thank you again for questions and comments. I'm sorry, comrade, I didn't hear the first part of your question or comment because we had here some issues, but I hope that we can discuss it in dinner. But for the critique of you and Peter both, I just answer that for me it makes sense to keep these categories separate so that we can have commodity production, but it doesn't necessarily involve exploitation. So we can have other forms of commodity production than capitalist one, which involves then exploitation. And I think at least, and I guess I'm not the only one, that when you have commodity production, then it is a case that the relations between producers appear as relations between things, between objects, and also these people become dependent on the market. So there are many cases in history where commodity producers who are not hegemonic in a society but who exist, some kind of catastrophe happens to them because they are the market decides upon their life. But in capitalism, this is the case that it rules the whole society. It affects us all, not only commodity producers, but the whole society. This just makes sense to me. In this context, my point was just that Alfred Schmidt and his followers and these, they seem to address that the problem in capitalism is that production is not planned, and that we are not consciously regulating our relations to each other and nature. And I think that this is not the specific problem of capitalism.
I think it's my turn. So about your question on about the breakout between urban and rural middle classes, I think yes, the focus of my research was indeed to critique and challenge the urban bias in the studies of the middle class, because the developing literature on the middle class considered the middle class to be an urban phenomena only. And so my attempt was to kind of really challenge this urban bias. And whether Marx is a relevant framework to study the middle classes, if I understood your question correctly, well, I think so, because Marx talks about the middle classes in a fragmentary way, and he talks about a skilled labor, which was also the focus of my thesis. In fact, in his last page in volume 3 of Das Kapital, he started talking about the classes that are formed because of the access to kind of education and skill and the social network. So I think, yes, that makes Marx pretty much relevant. And also my other attempt was to use the three major theorists of class, Pierre Bourdieu, Max Weber, and Marx, to study the rural middle classes. I don't think Marx would have been happy if I left him out when I used Weber and Bourdieu. And about your question about Patnaik's labor index, yes, I have developed on Patnaik's labor index to formulate my own, but Patnaik's labor index is only about the number of labor days that are kind of hired, and it doesn't really kind of go into wages and the variation that exists between the wages that women and men receive in India. So I have brought that into my thesis as well. I didn't put it in my presentation because there was no time, but I'm happy to go over it with you after this session.
Just to end, we would like to underline how much greatly we enjoy the interdisciplinary aspect of the conference, focus on Marx, but very often it may be focused mostly on economics, and even if it's very important, we really appreciate highly the place given to humanities and art, which play a great role by Marx too.
Only to finish, to say that mostly in the Western world you see that it's very rationalized world today, and when you see it from the romantic point of view you can understand this, and nowadays for re-enchanting the world or reimagining the world, it's necessary nowadays to have this kind of wide-based cross-disciplinary conferences. It may be about Marx, but about other topics, and it's very important to pursue, to continue this kind of events or manifestations. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I think we have all performed our socially necessary labor for today, and we can now proceed to the reproductive activity of consuming food. Thank you all for an excellent panel.